Today we're going to take you through the process of finishing a neck. This one is a maple neck with a rosewood fretboard. So first we'll tape off the entire face of it, do our sanding sealer coats, a few coats of neck amber just to bring out the grain, and then our clear coats. Then we'll leave it for a few weeks to dry and then follow up by wet sanding and polishing just to bring out that mirror kind of flat shine to it. And then we'll be all set. Hope you enjoy. Okay, thanks for joining us today. We're going to cover the various steps in finishing a maple neck with a rosewood fretboard. The type of wood is important because in cases like this where we have a rosewood or maybe an ebony fretboard, these are traditionally left unfinished on the surface. However, the sides will receive the same application of lacquer as the rest of the maple neck. So we start by taping off the face of the fretboard, and then we'll follow up with our sealer coats and continue from there. Okay, so what I've done so far is I've taped off the first side of this fretboard. I basically just used the straight side of the tape just to line up exactly with the side of the fretboard. That way you don't have to worry about cutting it and making sure that everything lines up well. I find that if you can just kind of line it up and match it really nicely, that's about as accurate as anything else. I just use my fingernail to kind of make sure everything is wrapped over each individual fret so that you don't risk getting any lacquer kind of underneath when it's spraying. And when I measure out the piece, I always leave about an extra inch for that kind of extra lengths that are required for just going over each individual fret. So we're just going to match the second piece up on here. Just kind of gently tack that side on just as a general guide. And once we're finished on both ends, we'll use a straight razor or like a Stanley razor just to get a nice clean cut. You want to make sure that it's pressed down firmly, just so that as you're spraying over the next few days, nothing comes off and it's just nice and secure so you don't risk getting any lacquer underneath it. One thing I forgot to mention earlier is that before we did anything, we sanded the entire neck except the fretboard to 400 grit to prep it for sealer, and we sanded it with the grain, and we were just careful like on the fret edges not to scuff those up at all. For our sanding sealer, we'll apply a total of 3 coats, each coat consisting of 3 passes. We'll space these 1 hour apart and let them dry overnight before we move on to sanding them level. Remember that when we're spraying with aerosols, we always want to start our spray off of the piece, move it onto the instrument, and then stop the spray once we've moved past the instrument. This just helps to reduce the risk of any sputtering from the nozzle that might occur when the airflow stops or starts. Okay, so yesterday we sprayed a few coats of sanding sealer onto this neck. We're gonna be wet sanding it now. I'm using 600 grit sandpaper. I wouldn't want to go any coarser than that just because there's so many edges and kind of contours on this that the risk of sanding through is pretty apparent. If you do sand through on a sealer coat, it's not a huge deal. I would just kind of finish what you're doing, try your best not to sand through anymore. And before you start your color coats, just give it a quick extra spray of sealer just to make sure you're not spraying onto exposed wood, and it'll just keep your tinted coats kind of more consistent looking. So we're gonna get underway. Again, wear a respirator. It doesn't have to be anything as fancy as what I'm using. Just a regular face respirator works well. I can get them on Amazon for 40 bucks. And I'm using mineral spirits. It's what I like using. Water, just, you know, if it gets in any holes where there's exposed wood, risks kind of swelling the wood in that area. So I like to use mineral spirits. So yeah, we'll get to it. I'm not using a sanding block on this just because there are so many contours and corners, edges. I'm just kind of using my fingers and just trying to be as careful as possible to apply pressure evenly. We're gonna check our work often, and just like when we were wet sanding on our body, you're looking for any of those shiny divots, and we wanna make everything kind of matte in appearance. If there's anything that's still shiny, that means that the sandpaper hasn't reached that depth yet, and that we need to keep attacking that area until it's all matte in color, and that means that it's all consistently flat. This went on quite well when we were spraying this, and since it's those first few layers of finish, you shouldn't have to do too much wet sanding to get it level. We'll let that dry for another minute, but like that already looks quite good. It's a pretty big piece. I'm just gonna cut it down a little bit. Just a little bit easier to work with. Anytime you have these break angles on the edges like here or up on the headstock, those are the areas that you're most likely to sand through. So just keep checking your work. Alright, so after we leveled out our sanding sealer coats by wet sanding with the mineral spirits, we waited until the next day to continue with our neck amber coats. The reason that we didn't spray them immediately after sanding is that the wood needs time to dry from whatever liquid you end up using in the wet sanding process. If we sprayed too soon and there was still some mineral spirits in one of the cavities or under a piece of tape, that could contaminate the lacquer that's being sprayed and create issues. So I usually like to play it safe and just let the piece dry off overnight after any wet sanding and then tackle the spraying the next day.
Our neck amber lacquer is basically a thinned out clear coat with a mix of dyes added to create a rich amber tint. The color will darken and deepen with each pass, so you can really dial in whatever you're after. 1 or 2 light coats will give that lightly aged tinted maple look. However, if you apply it heavier with several passes like we're doing in this example, you can achieve that deep vintage amber tone that traditionally was the result of the wood and lacquer aging over years and decades. We usually recommend doing a series of lighter coats instead of 1 or 2 heavier ones. This will help you control the application of the lacquer and reduce the risk of runs. You really want to nail your color coats when you're dealing with transparent colors, since it's really difficult to keep a consistent look if you need to sand out a run or blemish. So just go slow and gradually build up until you're happy with the color. Anytime I spray a transparent color, I like to immediately follow up with a few light passes of blush remover, which is a lacquer retarder aerosol that we offer. It just allows the lacquer a bit more time to flow out evenly on the surface before it dries. It's not a crucial step, but it can help to give the tint a bit more of a consistent overall appearance and reduce any surface texture, which might translate into the finish.
Okay, so this has had a night to dry. Yesterday we did one kind of heavy coat on this neck. The neck amber is good because you can do several really light coats until you kind of get that tone that you're after. I kind of knew what I wanted, and I'm pretty well versed with aerosols, so I was kind of able to tackle it all in one kind of heavier coat. You probably saw in the video, I just kind of kept moving around to different areas so that we didn't risk having any one area too wet. So we didn't risk any runs or anything like that. So this came out well. We'll start doing our clear coats today. On a body, I'd usually do about 12 clear coats. I like to do a little bit more on a neck, upwards like 15 or 16, just because almost the entire thing is edges and corners and contours, so you have a lot more risk of kind of just burning through when you're wet sanding and buffing it. So we'll do 3 or 4 coats of clear today, and then we'll do that every day until we're at about 15 or 16 coats.
Okay, we're on to our clear coats here. We're going to spray a total of 14 coats, again, each coat consisting of 3 passes. We're only showing you a portion of the coats that were applied here. Same rules as always, no more than 3 coats per day, 1 hour of drying time between each. The only reason that we would need to sand between any of these would be if a piece of debris had landed in our wet lacquer or if we ended up with a run. If this occurs, just let it dry overnight and then wet sand with something light like 600 grit just until the problem is corrected. We want to make absolutely sure that we don't sand into the color coats. If we try to remove something out of a wet or soft finish, we can actually make it worse by potentially pushing it deeper into the lacquer. Once all of our clear coats have been applied, we're going to let this neck dry in a well-ventilated area for the next 4 weeks before we move on to wet sanding and buffing.
Okay, so today we're gonna be wet sanding this neck. So it's had about 4 weeks to dry now. We did a total of 14 clear coats on it. So it's given it a nice amount of build. So we've got less chance of kind of sanding through on any of the edges or contours. We're gonna be progressing through a series of wet sandpapers. So we're gonna start with 600 grit and move up to about 1500. We can go finer than that into 2000 grit and so on, but the more grits that we go through, the more chance we have sanding through. So 600 is going to be
coarse enough for us to kind of cut through and get some of that texture off the top. If it's your first time, you can start at 800 grit and, you know, reduce that chance of sanding through, but, you know, you're gonna spend a longer time wet sanding. Make sure you've got a stack of paper towels. We're gonna be wearing a respirator so that we're not inhaling any fumes. We're working with mineral spirits today. You could also use naphtha. I prefer to use those for wet sanding so that there's no risk of them swelling the wood. If you use water for wet sanding, which some people do, when it gets in any of the cavities, if they're not sealed up, it can swell the wood, and you'll actually see these lines where the wood's raised in those areas, or just kind of look like a line progressing with the grain of the wood, and you can't come back from that. A lot of times it kind of just ruins the finish. We took the tape off the fretboard about an hour after the final clear coat was applied. You want to do that fairly early on when the lacquer is still a little bit soft. If you wait until it's had, you know, too much time to dry, you know, you don't want to do it at the end of 4 weeks, because when you're taking it off, it may chip up any of the edges that the tape is attached to. So do it kind of the same day where your last coat's applied, and it's a lot softer and just safer to kind of pull off. So we're gonna get started on this. We're gonna, like I said, we're gonna use the 600 grit to remove most of the texture, and then we're gonna progress to 800 grit, 1000, 1200, and maybe 1500. After that, we're gonna do 2 grades of polish, our medium polish and our fine, which will remove any kind of fine swirl marks, and we should be good to go after that. Okay, so basically the whole purpose of what we're doing today is to level out this finish. Now, I've just quickly sanded this area here, and you can see that anything that the sandpaper has hit is very dull in appearance. You'll see all these little areas of shine, and those are the lower areas that haven't actually been worked by the sandpaper yet. So we're gonna slowly sand this entire area until it's basically all completely matte. You'll have to wipe your finish every so often just to get the liquid off to see if it's truly, you know, matte in appearance. A lot of times I'd be using a block to sand, but since there's so many break angles and contours on a neck, we're just using a square of sandpaper with our fingers today. And yeah, basically the whole purpose is just to get all these shiny areas to look completely matte. So all these little kind of specks here, we want to be gone. And then once we see that, we can progress with the finer grits of sandpaper. That looks quite good. Pretty much everything is completely matte here. You can see a few areas, but once we hit it with the 800, that'll go away. I'm just gonna hit the areas down around the neck heel here. You do have a little bit more of an accented break angle there, so just like the other areas, you know, gotta be kind of aware of that. We're almost finished with the 600 grit. We're just finishing up the headstock face here. Then we just have to do the edges on the headstock, which are kind of the area that just require a little bit more attention so that we don't sand through.
That headstock face looks good. We've got a little bit of a shine there, but we'll be able to knock that down once we move it on the next one. So for the edges, I just like to have kind of like a nice smaller one, and we're just gonna gradually kind of lightly go through this.
Okay, so we're all finished with our wet sanding. We went all the way up to 1500 grit and then we stopped. You can see right here on the edge of the neck and into the fretboard a little bit, we started to get a bit of a sand through. It's not a big deal. That wood is still sealed, and luckily it's on the underside of the neck, so like nobody will see it. But that's just kind of a good example of, you know, I was able to catch it early because I saw it occurring and I just stopped sanding. Luckily all the texture had already been removed, so it's fine. You know, we'll leave it and we can move on to polishing. But you can see overall we've got a really nice consistent surface here. We don't have any real big divots or anything, and everything's matte in appearance, which will allow us to polish this and bring this up to a gloss. Okay, we're finished with our wet sanding, so now we're gonna move on to just a two-step polishing system. We've got a medium compound, which kind of lets you move on after 1200 or 1500 grit. I like to go up to 1500 if possible. Just less elbow grease required in the polishing. And then our fine compound kind of takes care of the last kind of bit of swirl marks or kind of micro scratches at that point. So I usually just grab something like a microfiber cloth, works really well. And we're just gonna apply a little dollop to a rag and kind of do it in sections. So we'll start with the back of the headstock here. I've actually got quite a lot on here. It's more than we need, but it's all right. I'm just gonna work it in. You'll really see it kind of shine up quite quickly. At first it'll kind of take on this kind of matte looking haze, and then as it really kind of starts to activate on the finish, you'll see it kind of just bring out that luster right away. If you're doing a satin finish, you can either use our satin lacquer or really kind of just, a lot of people use our clear gloss and just stop at this point. They don't move on to the buffing step. They just kind of wet sand up to about 1500, and that kind of gives you that satin look also. But if you are using the satin lacquer, I wouldn't even kind of bother with the buffing stage, just because you can even bring satin lacquer up to a high gloss if you buff it enough. So you can see even with the medium polish, we've already got like a really nice shine there. So you can really see the difference kind of between polishing, like on this area here, versus the front of the headstock, which has still been wet sanded to a really nice grit, but it still very much has that satin kind of matte appearance. So that's kind of where it's up to you. If you want to leave it that kind of more dull, kind of like a more relic look, or if you like that really deep kind of gloss, like luster to it. You know, I feel like both have their applications.
I always liked kind of the more vintage look myself, but once you spend time on it, you kind of see what it can be. I don't know, the gloss look has its place also. Now, especially with the medium compound, it is still somewhat abrasive. So especially on the edges, you want to be careful not to kind of dig in too heavily, because you can kind of still end up with like a burn through. You know, a lot of people have been at the last part of their finishing experience, you know, final buffing, and they end up burning through. And, you know, it's not the end of the world. I mean, especially if you are going for a relic look, you can play it off, but it's just something you want to be aware of. Okay, so we've polished up this neck with our medium polish now. We've got a nice shine going on every area here, but we're just gonna finish it off with our fine polish, which will just kind of really bring it home. Any of the fine swirl marks will be removed. Any areas that are still kind of left not completely like gloss looking, it'll just really tighten it up here. So get a new cloth, or at least a new area of your microfiber cloth, because you don't want any of that medium polish kind of getting worked in. And we're just gonna do our kind of same deal. So that area that we had the sand through on originally, if we hit that with too much buffing, it would kind of worsen it. So you still want to buff that area, but you don't want to kind of lay into it too much if you don't want to risk kind of removing any of that lacquer there. But once you've kind of applied some of that polish and worked it through, just kind of use a dry, like new clean area of the rag, just kind of polish it off. And you can really see kind of how deep that kind of clear gloss has come out. So I'm going to continue on the rest of this neck. Probably take about another 10 minutes here just to bring everything up to a high shine, and that brings us home.